Ada for firing my now ex-best friend is my home health aide. Also Wibda if I get her fired now completely from the company for her actions. I am a 43-year-old woman living with several chronic health conditions that have left me disabled. My daily life is a constant challenge, a delicate balance of managing my physical limitations and navigating a world that feels increasingly difficult to keep up with. My disabilities aren't visible at first glance, which often leads to misunderstandings or assumptions from others that I'm just fine. But the truth is far more complex. One of the most critical aspects of my care plan is the presence of a home health aide, someone who assists me with daily tasks to ensure my safety. My mobility is limited, and I'm a significant fall risk, which means having someone around isn't just a luxury, it's a necessity. Simple tasks like reaching for something on a high shelf or navigating my way to the bathroom can quickly become dangerous without assistance. Falling isn't just a concern, it's a genuine fear that I carry with me every day, and that anxiety only grows when I'm alone. Adding to the complexity of my life is my severe social anxiety. For as long as I can remember, social interactions have been challenging for me. The very thought of engaging with strangers is enough to send my heart racing and my thoughts spiraling. I've always preferred the quiet solitude of my own company, retreating from the chaotic world outside. While I know my introversion serves as a protective shield, it also isolates me, making it difficult to connect with others. Over the years, I've learned to live with this anxiety, but it remains a constant companion, always there, lurking in the background. Having a home health aide was supposed to be a way to alleviate some of my anxieties and improve my quality of life. However, the idea of inviting a stranger into my personal space, where I feel most vulnerable, was enough to make my chest tighten and my palms sweat. I couldn't imagine going through the process of interviewing aides, explaining my needs, and then trying to build trust with someone I barely knew. The thought alone was paralyzing. That's why, when the need for an aide became undeniable, I made a decision that felt logical at the time. I reached out to my best friend, Maria, who had been a steadfast presence in my life for the past 15 years. Maria was 53 years old, a whirlwind of energy and charisma, a stark contrast to my quiet, reserved nature. She had always been the life of the party, the one who could walk into a room and instantly become the center of attention. She was loud, boisterous, and unapologetically herself. But beyond her exuberant personality, Maria was also incredibly meticulous and organized. She prided herself on her cleanliness, often joking about her obsession with tidiness. It was a trait that I found endearing and one that made her an ideal candidate to be my home health aide. After all, who better to help me maintain order in my life than someone who thrived on structure and cleanliness? What made the decision even easier was the fact that Maria wasn't a stranger. She knew me, really knew me. She understood my quirks, my anxieties, and my limitations. I trusted her implicitly, and that trust was a rare and precious thing for someone like me. Knowing that Maria would be my aide meant that I wouldn't have to endure the awkwardness of explaining my needs to someone new. I wouldn't have to worry about judgment or misunderstanding. With Maria, I could simply be myself without fear. The arrangement seemed perfect, almost too good to be true. At first, it was. When Maria started working as my aide, it felt like a seamless transition. She brought her characteristic energy and enthusiasm into my home, tackling household tasks with vigor. She was efficient and thorough, ensuring that my living space remained clean and organized. More importantly, she provided me with a sense of security. I knew that if I needed help, Maria would be there. Her presence alleviated some of the anxiety that had become a constant undercurrent in my life. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe a little easier. Of course, Maria's personality remained unchanged. She was still loud and opinionated, often expressing her thoughts with unfiltered candor. But I had grown accustomed to her bluntness over the years. I knew that her remarks, however sharp they might seem to others, came from a place of genuine care and concern. Maria wasn't one to sugarcoat things, but I appreciated her honesty. It was refreshing in a world where people often danced around the truth. In those early days, I felt grateful to have her by my side. However, life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. The problems began to surface about a year into our arrangement. At first, they were small inconveniences, little ripples that I tried to ignore. In July, Maria started calling me at the last minute to inform me that she would be late or, worse, that she wouldn't be coming at all. The reasons varied, but they often revolved around her family. Her daughter needed her to watch the grandkids, or there was some other pressing matter that required her immediate attention. I understood that life happens, and I tried to be accommodating. After all, Maria wasn't just my aide, she was my friend. I didn't want to be rigid or demanding, especially when she had been so helpful to me. But the calls became more frequent, and the excuses more varied. It wasn't long before Maria took on a babysitting job for a neighbor, which meant that she couldn't be with me during the hours I had requested. This was more than a minor inconvenience. It disrupted the routine that we had established. I rely heavily on structure to manage my anxiety, and any deviation from that routine can send me into a tailspin. Still, I tried to be understanding. I told myself that it was better to have Maria as my aide, even if it wasn't perfect, than to go through the anxiety-inducing process of finding someone new. I convinced myself that a familiar face, even an unreliable one, was preferable to a stranger. However, things took a turn for the worse when Maria began showing up only on Sundays. She was scheduled to work 5 days a week, but those other days became increasingly rare. Her absences left me feeling isolated and vulnerable. The very reason I had hired her to ensure my safety was being undermined by her inconsistency. I found myself alone more often than not, and my anxiety skyrocketed as a result. The breaking point came on a day that still haunts me. I was home alone, attempting to go about my daily tasks, when I lost my balance and fell. The impact was jarring, and my head struck the edge of the kitchen counter with a sickening thud. The pain was immediate, radiating through my skull and down my spine. I lay on the floor, disoriented and frightened, for what felt like an eternity. It took me over an hour to muster the strength to pull myself up. All the while, a single thought echoed in my mind: I could have been seriously injured or even died, and no one would have known. Maria was supposed to be there during that time. She was supposed to be the safety net that prevented situations like this. But she wasn't there. I tried to call her, desperate for reassurance, but my calls went unanswered. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. It wasn't until 3 days later that Maria finally showed up on her usual Sunday visit. By then, the anger and frustration that had been simmering beneath the surface had reached a boiling point. When she arrived, I sat her down for a serious conversation. I laid everything out in the open, explaining how her actions or lack thereof had affected me. I told her that things needed to change, that I couldn't continue to live with the uncertainty and anxiety that her absences caused. I needed her to fulfill the responsibilities she had agreed to when she took on this role. I wasn't asking for anything beyond what was expected of her as my aide. I needed her to show up during her scheduled hours and to give me adequate notice if she couldn't make it. It wasn't an unreasonable request. It was the bare minimum that any employer would expect from an employee. Maria listened, nodding along as I spoke. She assured me that she understood and that things would change. But her words turned out to be hollow promises. That conversation in early November seemed like a turning point, yet it quickly became apparent that Maria had no intention of altering her behavior. There wasn't even a brief period of improvement to suggest she was making an effort. Instead, her absences grew more frequent, and her silence became more pronounced. By the end of that month, she stopped answering my calls altogether on the days she was supposed to work. Sundays became the only time I saw her. She wouldn't offer any explanation for her behavior, and when I tried to bring up the issue, she would evade the conversation or change the subject. It was as though our friendship and the trust we had built over 15 years meant nothing to her. I kept warning Maria that if she didn't improve, I would be forced to find a new aide. I hated the thought of replacing her. The guilt gnawed at me, and I wrestled with the decision for weeks. The idea of firing my best friend made me feel like a monster. But at some point, self-preservation kicked in. My safety and well-being had to come first. I spoke to another friend about my situation, venting my frustrations and fears. Let's call her Penny. Penny was 30 years old, empathetic, and reliable. She offered to step in as my new aide, saying she would be happy to help. I hesitated at first, still holding on to the hope that Maria would change. But deep down, I knew it was a lost cause. Penny's offer was a lifeline that I couldn't afford to ignore. In mid-December, I made my final decision. I informed Maria that I would be hiring someone new. I don't know if she didn't believe me or simply chose to ignore my warnings, but her reaction when Penny officially took over was one of shock and outrage. She showed up at my door the week before Christmas, her face a mask of fury. Her voice, usually loud and cheerful, was filled with venom as she accused me of ruining her holiday plans. She claimed that I was destroying her grandkids' Christmas, blaming me for their supposed disappointment. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I loved those kids. I had watched them grow up, and the thought of causing them any pain was unbearable. The guilt I already felt intensified, nearly breaking me. But I had to stand firm. My decision was made. I couldn't continue living in fear and uncertainty for the sake of maintaining a toxic situation. Maria's reaction didn't end with that confrontation. She immediately blocked me on all social media platforms, cutting off all contact. It was a clean break, or so I thought. But soon, whispers began to reach me, rumors and lies that Maria had been spreading about me. The betrayal was like salt in a wound that hadn't even begun to heal. One of the most egregious lies she told involved a mutual friend who had lent me her car for a week. My son had been using our only vehicle for work, so our friend graciously offered her car to help me out. According to Maria, I had wrecked the car, a claim that eventually reached the friend's boyfriend. Concerned, my friend called me to ask what had happened. I assured her that the car was fine when I left it at my ex's house earlier that day. I explained that I had ridden out of town with my son to handle some family matters following a death in the family. I promised to check on the car as soon as I returned. When I did, I found that the car was exactly as I had left it, undamaged and in perfect condition. Maria's story was completely fabricated. But the lies didn't stop there. She told my ex-husband that I had crashed that same car into a tree with our kids inside. The accusation was beyond absurd, and it infuriated me. My ex, naturally concerned for our children's safety, questioned our son about the incident. My son, thankfully, set the record straight, telling his father that no such accident had ever occurred. It was a blatant lie, one designed to tarnish my reputation and sow discord in my co-parenting relationship with my ex-husband. But perhaps the most egregious violation was what she told my ex about my health. Maria had been privy to some of my most personal and private medical information during her time as my aide. She had accompanied me to doctor's appointments and was well aware of the challenges I faced daily. That information was shared with her in confidence, as part of her role as my caregiver. But she took that sacred trust and shattered it, divulging my health issues to my ex-husband, someone who had no right to that information. Our divorce meant that my medical history was no longer his concern, as long as it didn't impact my ability to care for our children. My health issues had never affected my parenting, so there was no reason for him to know the details of my condition. The betrayal cut deep. My health is a deeply personal matter, one that I have always guarded fiercely. The thought that Maria would use that information against me, weaponizing my vulnerabilities to create drama, left me livid. It wasn't just a breach of trust, it was a violation of my privacy, one that I believed fell under the protection of HIPAA laws. As a home health aide, Maria had a legal obligation to safeguard my personal health information. She wasn't even allowed to disclose her clients' names, let alone share their medical details with outsiders. I knew that when she was hired, she had been informed of these confidentiality requirements. Yet she chose to ignore them, spreading my private information like gossip. I was furious. My anger burned hotter with each passing day as I learned more about the lies she had been telling. It wasn't just the betrayal of our friendship that hurt, it was the malicious intent behind her actions. Maria wasn't simply venting her frustrations or speaking out of turn. She was deliberately trying to damage my reputation, to paint me as someone reckless and untrustworthy. Her actions were vindictive, designed to cause maximum harm. And for what? Because I had the audacity to put my safety and well-being first? Because I had hired someone new to do the job she had abandoned? The more I thought about it, the more justified I felt in my decision to replace her. The guilt that had weighed so heavily on me began to lift, replaced by a sense of righteous indignation. I had done what I needed to do to protect myself. I had given Maria every opportunity to improve, to honor the commitment she had made when she took on the role of my aide. She had chosen to disregard those opportunities, to prioritize her own interests over her responsibilities. The consequences of her actions were hers to bear, not mine. Still, the question lingered: should I report her to the company she worked for? Part of me hesitated. Despite everything, I didn't want to be the one responsible for getting her fired. I knew she had a family to support, grandchildren who adored her. But the other part of me, the part that had been hurt and betrayed, screamed for justice. What Maria had done wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. She had violated my privacy, spread falsehoods, and endangered my relationship with my children's father. If she could do that to me, what was to stop her from doing it to someone else? What if her next client was even more vulnerable, unable to defend themselves against her gossip and lies? The weight of that responsibility pressed heavily on me. This wasn't just about me, it was about protecting others from Maria's recklessness. I knew that reporting her was the right thing to do, even if it meant severing any remaining ties with the person who had once been my closest friend. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was a necessary one. And as I made my way to the phone to make that call, I reminded myself that I deserved to feel safe, respected, and valued. I deserved better than the betrayal I had endured. It all started to really get to me when I fell and busted my head off the edge of the kitchen counter. The pain was instant and blinding, but the fear that followed was even worse. My body crumpled to the floor, my legs weak and trembling from the shock of the impact. For a moment, I lay there stunned, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. Then the panic set in. I was alone. Completely and utterly alone. No one was there to help me, no one to hear my cries if I needed assistance. I struggled to sit up, my head pounding and spinning, but my arms felt like lead. Every attempt to lift myself off the cold tile floor ended in failure. I was disoriented, dizzy, and terrified. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. My hands shook as I reached for my phone, desperate to call for help. I dialed Maria's number, praying she would pick up. She was supposed to be here. She was scheduled to be at my home during that time, precisely to prevent situations like this from happening. But as the phone rang endlessly without an answer, my heart sank deeper into my chest. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I left a voicemail, my voice shaky and weak, pleading for her to call me back. Still, nothing. After what must have been over an hour, I finally managed to push myself off the floor, using the counter for support. My knees wobbled, my hands gripping the edge so tightly my knuckles turned white. All I kept thinking was how much worse it could have been. What if I had hit my head harder? What if I had lost consciousness? What if no one found me for days? I couldn't shake those thoughts as I stood there, trembling and aching, staring at the phone in my hand with growing frustration and anger. I shouldn't have had to endure that alone. Maria should have been there. She was supposed to be my safety net, the person ensuring that moments like this didn't spiral into disasters. The very reason I hired her was to prevent this exact scenario. Yet she wasn't there. The betrayal of her absence stung deeply. I tried calling her again. No answer. I sent a text message, hoping that maybe she was just busy and would call back soon. But the hours dragged on, and my phone remained silent. It wasn't until Sunday, 3 days later, that Maria finally showed up for her usual once-a-week visit. When she walked through the door, cheerful as always, I felt a surge of mixed emotions. Anger, relief, sadness, it all swirled together, making it hard to know what to feel first. I didn't want to lash out immediately, but the weight of what had happened was too heavy to ignore. I set her down at the kitchen table, forcing myself to stay composed even as my emotions bubbled beneath the surface. I explained what had happened, how I had fallen, how long it had taken me to get up, how terrified I had been. I told her how I had called her, left voicemails, and sent texts, all to no avail. I tried to keep my voice steady, but the heart was clear in my tone. I could have been seriously hurt. Maria, I said, my voice breaking slightly. I needed you, and you weren't here. Maria's response was a mixture of defensiveness and dismissiveness. She apologized half-heartedly but quickly followed it up with excuses about how busy she had been with her family. Her daughter needed her to babysit, she explained. There had been unexpected errands and commitments. She kept repeating that life had just gotten in the way. I listened quietly, my heart sinking with each excuse she made. She wasn't taking responsibility for her actions or her absence. She wasn't acknowledging the gravity of what had happened. I laid out my expectations clearly, hoping to make her understand that things had to change. I need you here during your scheduled hours, I said firmly. If you're going to be late or can't make it, I need more than an hour's notice. I need you to do the job you were hired to do. Maria nodded, promising that things would improve. She assured me that she understood, that she would make a better effort to be present and reliable. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe her. After all, we had been best friends for over 15 years. Surely, she wouldn't let me down again. Surely, she would see how much her absence had affected me and do everything in her power to make things right. But that hope was short-lived. Her promises turned out to be empty words. There was no change, none at all. Not even a brief attempt to act as if she cared enough to improve. By the end of November, things had only gotten worse. Maria stopped answering my calls during her scheduled workdays altogether. The only time I saw her was on Sundays, when she would show up as if nothing was amiss. I would try to bring up her continued absences, but she would brush me off or change the subject, making it clear that she had no intention of discussing the matter. It was as though she believed our friendship would keep her immune to accountability, that I would tolerate her neglect simply because of our history. But I couldn't know. I wouldn't continue to live like that. The loneliness and fear were taking a toll on my mental health. Every day felt heavier, the weight of isolation pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. I kept warning Maria that if things didn't change, I would have to find a new aide. But my warnings fell on deaf ears. She either didn't believe me or didn't care. By mid-December, I had reached my breaking point. I couldn't endure the uncertainty any longer. I needed someone I could rely on, someone who would show up when they were supposed to, someone who wouldn't leave me vulnerable and alone. I confided in another friend, Penny. Penny was 30 years old, kind-hearted, and reliable. As I vented my frustrations to her, she listened intently, nodding along as I described the situation with Maria. When I finished, Penny offered a solution that I hadn't expected. "I could be your aide," she said. "I'd be happy to help. I know how much you've been struggling, and I'd love to make things easier for you." Her offer was a lifeline. The thought of having someone trustworthy and dependable was like a breath of fresh air. But at the same time, I felt a pang of guilt. Replacing Maria felt like a betrayal of our friendship, even though she had already betrayed my trust in so many ways. I wrestled with the decision for days, torn between loyalty and self-preservation. But ultimately, I knew what I had to do. My safety and well-being had to come first. I agreed to hire Penny, and I made one final attempt to warn Maria. I told her that I had found someone new to take over her position. I hoped that, finally, this would be the wake-up call she needed. But once again, she brushed it off, acting as though I wasn't serious. The reality hit her hard the week before Christmas, when Penny officially started as my aide. Maria showed up at my door, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. When she realized what had happened, her reaction was explosive. She yelled at me, her voice filled with rage and accusation. "You've ruined my grandkids' Christmas," she screamed, as though I had personally taken away their presents. Her words cut deep, and the guilt I had been trying to push aside came flooding back. I loved those kids. The idea that my decision could hurt them was almost too much to bear. But I knew I had to stay firm. I had given Maria every opportunity to change, and she had chosen not to. Her reaction didn't stop with that outburst. She blocked me on every platform, cutting me off completely. It was a clean break, but one that came with a new kind of pain. I had lost my best friend, someone who had been a significant part of my life for over 15 years. But even that pain paled in comparison to what came next. The whispers, the rumors, the lies. Maria wasn't content to simply walk away. She made it her mission to tarnish my name and destroy my reputation. I don't know if Maria never listened to me or simply didn't believe I would actually replace her, but when Penny officially started as my new aide, it became glaringly obvious that Maria had underestimated my resolve. The week before Christmas, Penny arrived at my home, cheerful and ready to help. It should have been a moment of relief, a fresh start, a sign that I was finally taking control of a situation that had spiraled out of my hands for far too long. Instead, that day became another emotional storm because Maria showed up unexpectedly and witnessed Penny in her place. The look on her face was one of utter shock, quickly morphing into something much darker, anger. The explosion that followed caught me off guard. Maria wasn't just upset, she was furious. She stood in my living room, yelling at me in a way I had never seen before. Her voice, usually loud but warm and familiar, was now cold and cutting, laced with accusations. "You've ruined my grandbaby's Christmas," she shouted, her eyes flashing with rage. "How could you do this to me?" Her words felt like knives, slicing through my resolve and leaving wounds of guilt and doubt. I loved her grandkids. I had seen them grow up. They had been like family to me for years. The thought that my decision could somehow affect their holiday filled me with shame, even though I knew deep down that her reaction was manipulative. Maria didn't stop there. She painted herself as a victim of my cruelty, claiming that my actions had destroyed her holiday plans and left her family in despair. The way she twisted the situation made me feel like a villain in my own story. The guilt I already carried grew heavier, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. I had never wanted things to end this way. I had never wanted to hurt Maria or her family. I only wanted to feel safe in my own home, to have someone I could rely on to be there when I needed them. But Maria made it clear that she saw my decision as a betrayal of our friendship, and she wasn't going to let it go. After that confrontation, Maria cut me out of her life completely. She blocked me on every platform, social media, phone calls, texts. It was as if our 15-year friendship had been erased overnight. There was no closure, no chance for reconciliation. One moment we were best friends, and the next, we were nothing to each other. The abruptness of it all left me reeling. I had expected her to be hurt, maybe even angry, but I hadn't expected her to sever all ties so quickly and completely. It felt like mourning the loss of a loved one, except this loss came with layers of confusion and bitterness. For days, I questioned myself. Was I truly the asshole? Had I overreacted? Had I failed to show Maria the empathy she deserved? The questions swirled in my mind, gnawing at me, making it hard to sleep or focus on anything else. I replayed our final conversation over and over, searching for moments where I might have handled things differently. But no matter how much I scrutinized my actions, I kept coming back to the same conclusion: I had done what I needed to do for my own safety and well-being. It wasn't a decision made out of malice or spite. It was a necessary step to protect myself from further harm. And yet, the guilt lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. That guilt began to dissolve, however, when I started hearing the things Maria had been saying about me. The betrayal I felt when I learned of her lies was overwhelming. It wasn't enough for Maria to walk away from our friendship. She wanted to destroy my reputation on her way out. The first incident that reached me involved a mutual friend who had kindly lent me her car. My son had been using our only vehicle for work, and this friend offered her car for me to use for a week. I was grateful for the gesture, especially during a difficult time, as we were dealing with a death in the family. But Maria, in her bitterness, took that act of kindness and twisted it into something ugly. According to the whispers that made their way back to me, Maria had told several mutual friends and acquaintances that I had wrecked the borrowed car. The rumor gained traction until it reached my friend's boyfriend, who became understandably concerned. My friend called me to ask what had happened. Her voice was cautious, and I could hear the tension in her tone. "I heard something," she began hesitantly. "Did something happen to the car?" The question stung. I had taken great care with that vehicle, treating it as if it were my own. I assured her that the car had been perfectly fine when I left it parked at my ex-husband's house earlier that day. I explained that I had ridden out of town with my son to handle family matters and that if any damage had occurred, it must have happened while the car was parked. After that call, I checked the car myself, my heart pounding with anxiety. To my immense relief, the car was exactly as I had left it: no scratches, no dents, no damage whatsoever. I called my friend back to confirm that everything was fine. But the damage Maria had intended to cause wasn't about the car itself. It was about planting seeds of doubt in the minds of those around me, chipping away at my reputation, little by little. The lies didn't stop there. Maria took things further, dragging my ex-husband into her web of deceit. She told him that I had slid into a tree with that borrowed car with our kids inside. The accusation was outrageous, a blatant fabrication designed to stir up trouble. My ex, naturally concerned for our children's safety, confronted our son during his week of custody. "Did something happen with the car?" he asked. "Were you in an accident with your mom?" Our son, bless his honesty, immediately set the record straight. "No, that never happened," he said firmly. "Mom didn't crash the car. It's not true." Hearing that my son had been questioned about my supposed recklessness broke something inside me. Maria wasn't just spreading petty rumors, she was actively trying to undermine my credibility as a parent. She knew how important my children were to me. She knew that my relationship with my ex-husband was already complicated enough without added tension. Yet she had deliberately planted that lie, knowing full well how damaging it could be. The betrayal was deeper than I had initially realized. Then came the final blow. Maria divulged personal, private health information to my ex-husband. The details she shared weren't things I had ever told him. Since our divorce, I had kept my medical issues private. He knew I was disabled, of course, but the specifics of my diagnoses and treatments were none of his business. I had made a conscious decision to keep that part of my life separate from our co-parenting relationship. But Maria, who had accompanied me to countless doctor's appointments and knew intimate details about my health, had taken it upon herself to share that information with him. When I found out, I was furious. My medical history is deeply personal. It's not something I share lightly, and certainly not something that should be weaponized against me. Maria knew that. As a home health aide, she had been entrusted with sensitive information under the assumption that she would uphold confidentiality. The fact that she had betrayed that trust wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. I couldn't believe that someone I had once considered my closest friend would stoop so low. My ex-husband started asking pointed questions about my health, questions that made it clear he had been fed information from someone who knew too much. He wanted to know if my conditions were worsening, if I was still capable of caring for our kids. His concern wasn't unwarranted, but the fact that he was suddenly so interested in my health made me suspicious. It didn't take long to trace the source of his newfound curiosity back to Maria. I was livid. Her actions were more than just gossip, they were a violation of my privacy and a direct attack on my ability to parent my children. The trust I had placed in her as both a friend and an aide had been completely shattered. It wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a professional one as well. As a home health aide, Maria had been bound by HIPAA regulations, laws designed to protect patient privacy. She had been explicitly told during her training that she couldn't share any information about her clients, not even their names. Yet she had blatantly disregarded those rules, spreading my personal information to anyone who would listen. The more I learned about her lies, the more my guilt began to dissolve. I had felt like an asshole for firing Maria. But now, I realized that she had been the one betraying me all along. She had taken advantage of my trust, of my vulnerability, and weaponized it against me the moment things didn't go her way. The person I thought was my best friend had become my worst enemy. My ex started asking our kids pointed questions about my health, questions that made my stomach churn with anger and dread. It was subtle at first. He'd ask things like, "Is your mom doing okay?" Or, "Have you noticed her getting more tired?" At first, I thought he was being unusually attentive, perhaps concerned because he knew I was disabled. But then the questions became more specific. He asked our son if I'd been having any more episodes of dizziness or falls. He asked our daughter if I was still going to my medical appointments regularly or if I had mentioned any new diagnoses. That's when it hit me like a punch to the gut. Maria. There was no other way he could know these things. I hadn't shared any details about my health with him since our divorce. Why would I? He was my ex-husband, not my current partner, and my medical issues were no longer any of his business. We co-parented effectively enough, and that was all that mattered. My disabilities never interfered with my ability to care for our kids during my time with them. I made sure of that. Whatever struggles I faced, I handled them privately, without burdening my children or involving their father. But now, thanks to Maria, my personal health issues were being dragged into conversations where they didn't belong. I could feel the heat of my fury rising as I pieced it all together. Maria had been there for countless doctor's appointments. She had driven me to specialists, sat in waiting rooms, and heard me discuss my symptoms and treatments with my medical team. She knew things about my body, my struggles, and my pain that I hadn't shared with anyone else. And now, she had taken that deeply personal knowledge and weaponized it against me, feeding it to my ex-husband as if it were gossip to be shared over coffee. The betrayal stung worse than anything else she had done. I could forgive missed shifts, last-minute cancellations, and even the petty rumors about a car accident that never happened. But this? Sharing my health information crossed an unforgivable line. It wasn't just a violation of our friendship, it was a violation of my privacy and my dignity. And it was illegal. As a home health aide, Maria was bound by HIPAA laws, designed to protect patient confidentiality. When she was hired, she would have been instructed multiple times that she wasn't allowed to share any information about her clients. Not even their names. That confidentiality extended to everything she learned while providing care. Medical conditions, medications, diagnoses, appointments. All of it was supposed to be protected. I remembered her telling me when she first got the job that her company had strict policies about patient privacy. They take it seriously, she had said. We're not even supposed to say who we're working with. Apparently, that promise of confidentiality had meant nothing to her. Maria had betrayed her professional responsibilities just as easily as she had betrayed our personal friendship. And now, my ex-husband, a man I had worked so hard to keep boundaries with new details about my health that I hadn't intended for him to know. Worse, he was using that information to question my ability to parent. It felt like a personal attack on my competency, my autonomy, and my dignity as a mother. I was beyond furious. My mind raced with questions and scenarios. Did Maria realize what she had done? Did she understand the gravity of sharing private health information with someone who had no right to it? Did she even care? Or had she been so consumed by her bitterness over losing her job that she wanted to hurt me in any way she could? The thought of confronting her crossed my mind, but what good would it do? She had already blocked me everywhere. There was no way to reach her directly. And honestly, I didn't want to speak to her. The betrayal cut too deep. Any words I had for her would be filled with anger, and I wasn't sure I could control myself if I faced her. That's when the thought struck me. I could call her employer. I knew the company she worked for. I had their contact information from the paperwork we had filled out when she was first hired as my aide. If I reported what she had done, there would be consequences. Sharing private health information was a serious violation of HIPAA laws. It wasn't just unprofessional, it was illegal. Maria could lose her job. She could even face legal action if the company took it seriously enough. But the thought of getting her fired gave me pause. Was I ready to go that far? Was I prepared to be the one who pulled the trigger on her career? Despite everything she had done, a part of me still felt the remnants of our long friendship. Memories of better times, of laughter and shared secrets, played in the back of my mind. I had loved her like a sister once. We had been inseparable for years. Could I really be the one to end her career over this? Then I thought about the bigger picture. This wasn't just about me. Maria was still working as a home health aide. She had other clients, people who were likely as vulnerable as I was, if not more so. If she had shared my private information, what was stopping her from doing the same to someone else? What if her next client had even more sensitive medical issues? What if she shared details about their mental health, their medications, their treatments? The thought made my blood run cold. Maria wasn't just a danger to me. She was a danger to anyone who trusted her with their care. I realized then that it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about getting even or making her pay for hurting me. It was about protecting others from the same betrayal I had experienced. If I stayed silent, I would be complicit in allowing her behavior to continue. I couldn't live with that on my conscience. With a deep breath, I picked up the phone and dialed the number for Maria's employer. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited for someone to answer. When the receptionist picked up, I introduced myself and explained that I needed to report a serious violation of client confidentiality. I was transferred to a supervisor, and I laid out everything: how Maria had been my aide, how she had shared my private health information without my consent, and how it had caused serious personal issues for me. I made sure to emphasize that this wasn't a personal grudge. It was a matter of professional ethics and legal compliance. The supervisor listened carefully, asking questions to clarify the details. They assured me that they took HIPAA violations very seriously and would conduct a thorough investigation. By the time I hung up the phone, my hands were shaking. The adrenaline coursing through my veins made me feel both empowered and exhausted. I had done the right thing. I knew that. But it still hurt. No matter how justified my actions were, the loss of a friendship, no matter how toxic it had become, was still a painful thing to process. Over the next few days, I waited anxiously for updates. I didn't know what would come of the investigation, but I hoped that it would prevent Maria from harming anyone else. I spoke to Penny about it, seeking comfort and reassurance. She told me that I had done the right thing, that I was brave for standing up for myself and protecting others. Her words helped ease some of the lingering guilt, but the emotional wounds Maria had left would take time to heal. A few weeks later, I received a call from the supervisor I had spoken to. They thanked me for bringing the issue to their attention. They confirmed that Maria had been terminated from her position due to the violation. Hearing those words brought a mix of relief and sadness. The chapter with Maria was officially closed. Our friendship was over, and she was no longer working as a home health aide. In the end, I learned a valuable lesson about boundaries, trust, and self-worth. Sometimes, protecting yourself means making difficult choices. Sometimes, the people you think will be there for you aren't who you believe them to be. And sometimes, you have to let go of toxic relationships, even when it hurts. Was I the asshole for firing Maria as my aide? No. I was someone who finally chose to prioritize my safety, my privacy, and my well-being. And that's never something to feel guilty about.